Good morning everyone and welcome to the LAI Public Libraries Online Conference 2020. Naturally we'd much prefer to meet you all live, but unfortunately due to COVID-19 all our talks for our conference this year are virtual. Still, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers for you. Our overall theme for the conference is A World in Change, Libraries Survive and Thrive, and it runs from November 2020 to April 2021. We have various subheadings for the different sessions. Number 1, books, the simple bare necessities, forget about your worries and strife, and that's a quote from Baloo in the Jungle Book. Number 2, uncertain times, the reading bug is here to stay. Number 3, wellbeing, mindfulness and resilience. Number 4, shared reading in digital land. And number 5, the ever popular My Life in Books panel. I'm delighted to introduce our guests for this session, Jane Davis and Patricia Ford. Jane Davis is the founder and director of the Reader Organisation, a national charity which helps to bring about a reading revolution so that everyone can experience and enjoy great literature, which they believe is a tool for helping humans survive and live well. Getting into reading groups are the main outreach activity of the Reading Organisation. These sessions bring people together and bring books to life. Jane Davis was elected to the Ashoka Fellowship in 2012, and in their introduction she was described in the following way. Jane Davis is changing the way people relate to literature, to each other and to themselves through a shared reading model called Get Into Reading, which brings small groups together on a weekly basis to read books and poems aloud. Her insight and approach to reading is that it can be used as a therapeutic tool to help people to articulate their feelings, thoughts and life experiences. Through the Get Into Reading model, Jane is redefining the value of literature and the role that reading aloud can play in improving mental health, community and well-being. Our moderator for today is Patricia Ford. She's well known in many libraries but has been a particularly good friend to Galway public libraries over the years. She has lived in Galway all her life and she says it's her favourite city in the world. She's an author of books for children of all ages. Her novel, The Wordsmith, was published to great critical acclaim in 2015 and she has recently published a sequel entitled Mother Tongue. Her many books for younger children include Bumplefizzle, The Best on Planet Earth, which was chosen as the Dublin UNESCO Citywide Read in 2019, To the Island, a picture book especially commissioned by Galway 2020 European Capital of Culture for all children who started in school in Galway in 2020. A former director of Galway International Arts Festival, she is currently chairperson of Children's Books Ireland. Please enjoy Jane Davis in discussion with Patricia Ford.
Hello and welcome to the LAI Public Libraries Online Conference 2020. Well, my guest today is the wonderful Jane Davis, who is the director of a charity called The Reader, whose aim is to bring books to all those who need them. Jane, hello and welcome.
Hi, it's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Where are you?
I'm in my sitting room at home at West Kirby, which is a little seaside town in the northwest of England. And I've been here more or less in this very spot since March.
So you're getting tired of it by now. And Jane, is that where you're from originally, or where does your story begin?
It does actually begin in Wirral, which is where West Kirby is, but further down the coast towards Chester. I was a kid in a little coal mining town called Neston, and then my parents were people who were moving every 5 minutes. So I've lived in hundreds of places as a child and went to about 16 different schools and left school with, you know, a very patchy education. And
What
then
was that
I've spent
like,
most of my
Jane?
life in Liverpool.
What was it like as an experience as a small child, all that moving around and changing school and friends and everything?
I think it was always unsettling, but on the other hand, I think it made me really good at just being able to walk into a room and think, hey, who's going to be my friend here?
Yeah.
And so I'm pretty outgoing in public life. And I think it made me very adaptable. I'm pretty good at sort of finding myself somewhere and thinking, right, I've got to do something here. What is it?
Yeah, it's almost anything, isn't it, in childhood? That's tough. At least it makes you a bit more resilient.
But it wasn't good for learning my times tables. You know,
Continuity would have been poor.
really regret that. And I still think, oh, if only I'd learned them.
And if you had got a school report, Jane, when you were 10, what would it have said about you?
It would have said I was a very keen reader and loves writing, a bit dreamy, and I think probably at 10, relatively well behaved, you know, keen to please.
And Jane, what do you remember about your first altercation with books? What were the first books in your life that you remember?
Oh, really clearly remember 3 childhood books, which I got each of them for Christmas. I don't know when, but one was Tales from the Arabian Nights, which was a sort of hardback, adult-sized book, not a big picture book, but it had little black and white drawings in it, and it had a terrible smell. It was a very cheap print, and it smelt as if it would make you, you know, go into a drugged state. But I absolutely, that was being transported to a very other world. So I love that one. And The Wind in the Willows. Now I see it really is a book based on what in England we'd call posh people, you know, picnic campers and boats on the river. But oddly enough, I just sort of thought, there's a world I can go into, and in I went. And the other one was Heidi, you know, which I guess lots of women my age must have loved as kids. So I don't really remember any picture books, or I do remember learning to read at school with Peter and Jane, Mother, Father, and the dog, whose name I think was Pat.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Yeah, and Mother and Father were very, very different to my mum and dad. But I adored Pat, and I feel I can almost remember learning to, at the moment of kind of realizing I could read it.
Yeah, it was like a code, wasn't it? You suddenly realized you could decode it and make sense of it.
Yeah, amazing experience.
And did someone read to you as a small child, Jane? Can you remember that?
I don't remember that at all. It's possible that it did. Mum might have done that. I don't remember that, but I do remember both of my parents and my granddad, Sid, telling stories and making them up. And they were always really good.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, you mentioned daydreaming, and I think that is such an important thing for children to have time to daydream if they're going to read or write, because it's kind of that space you need, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's one of the things I worry about now, is how to preserve that space for children who have, as we do in the West, you know, plenty of stuff coming at us from screens and other things, gaming, which I'm not against any of that. And I think a lot of it is good, but it takes up a lot of time. I mean, and it does for me, and I'm already, you know, a keen reader. So I
And
worry
I think
about
when
that
we
for
were
children.
children, very often my generation read out of boredom. There was very little else to do, so we read. And were you a child who went to the library? Did you discover the library at a young age?
Yeah. I remember it first in Neston when I must have been very young, and I remember the library desk that the librarian stood behind as being like a kind of pulpit, like a big high wall that they were behind. I suppose that's because I was so little, you know. And it had a lovely atmosphere there, and it looks down over the marshes to the River Dee and to North Wales. And I remember you'd go in one of the rooms of that very small library and see this vista, which always kind of made you go, wow, I don't know whether that connected with the books. I don't remember any books. I must have been under 5, I guess.
Yeah.
But the library I really remember is Toxteth Library in Liverpool 8, where we were there when I was about 12, 13, 14. And at that point, it was a pretty rundown public library in a poor part of town. But God, I loved it. I loved it. And, I just remember this whole big sort of room full of books and just, fantastic.
Yeah. It's that whole thing as well, isn't it, about plenty? The generosity of a library. There are plenty of books.
And the serendipity of not knowing what you would come across, which I think I was just thinking the other day, is oddly one of the things I like about Twitter is you find things you weren't looking for.
Yeah.
And I think that's what good secondhand bookshop or firsthand bookshop, but especially secondhand or a library offers us, that feeling of I came in for something maybe or not, and then I found something else. And that's, I don't know why that's so important, but it's as if it's to do with the place you're describing that you need for creative reading or writing isn't a place where there are a set kind of write this in 1,000 words with a beginning, middle, and an end. It's freer than that. And so I think that finding of things.
Isn't it kind of an adventure? Like you said, you go into a second-hand shop or a first-hand shop or a library, and you're introduced to things that you might never have thought about. And suddenly that becomes the thing you want to read. You want to read everything that author wrote. So it is a kind of an adventure. So would you say, Jane, with all of that, would you say you had a happy childhood?
With a lot of that, though, I mean, I had a difficult childhood. Things were pretty tough in our family, and they got worse. So
books were important to you
books were an important place, yeah. I think the reason Toxteth Library was so important was because by that point things were very unhappy in our family, and yet I could go there. I was the oldest child, oldest of 4. I had a lot of domestic duties, shall we say. I could go there to the library and just be out of that and be in other worlds. That was really, really important, especially when school started going wrong for me.
And you did struggle, from what I've read, I think you said you struggled academically, or you ended up not having the greatest results leaving school.
I didn't. I struggled to attend. That was one of my problems. And then because we lived in a pretty chaotic setup, so I also struggled to ever do homework or feel like a proper person at school. It was always like someone who's just arriving in the nick of time, just about with their school uniform on. And if that happened, that was a lucky day.
And when you were in that phase, the teenage phase of secondary school, were books still your friend then, or had you left all that behind you when you were 12?
Oh no, they were still very important to me. And I mean, I had other more dangerous friends by then, like drink, By the time I was 15, I would say, had become a good friend and dangerous characters in real life. But books were still fantastically important to me. So I read loads and loads of, I don't know, thrillers and things like that, and things like The Godfather and cheap paperbacks that were everywhere.
And great escapism.
But I also read things like, Samuel Beckett and went round all the time with a copy of Happy Days in my rucksack.
Wow.
And would read it to people to give them a flavour of another happy day.
I remember Richard Peck, the American children's writer, he said that for many children, the closest they get to an adult voice or adult guidance can be the voice of an author in a book.
I think that's really true. But that happened for me more like when I went to university, which was in my 20s. And then I got into sort of serious reading of literature. I felt that it was like, in a weird way, what having parents might be like for other people. There were kindly, wise people who knew a lot of stuff and would talk to you about how you should have behaved and things like that. I'm talking about Thomas Hardy or George Eliot or the complexities of Shakespeare as an undergraduate and after that into my 20s and 30s. They helped. They helped put my personality together in a, more responsible way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think what Richard Peck was talking about as well was that whole idea of kids now with, social media and the peer group, which he was very strong on, that they're the voices they're hearing if they're not reading. So if they do read, they get this other perspective. And that's obviously what happened to you at that age. And what was your first job, Jane? Where did you go? First of all, I'm a bit fascinated of, when you were saying the drink at 15 and you were a bit wild, what made you go to university? Why didn't you run a mile from that?
Well, my mum had a pub between when I was 12 and say 16. And so my first job was working in the pub as a barmaid from about the age of about probably, 13 or 14. I was behind the bar. And so later on, my first job was as a waitress in a Burnley Inn. And then I had quite a few cafe jobs and things like that. And then the reason it changed was because I was married and had a baby by the time I was 19. And my husband and I both wanted to be writers. And I got really fed up because I noticed that while he was in the kitchen typing on the portable Olivetti, I was doing the nappies and so on. I wasn't writing, I was looking after the baby. And so that provoked me to seek women's liberation, which I found downtown in Liverpool in the Women's Centre. And almost everybody I met through women's liberation was a graduate. And my daughter was, 2, 3. And I just began to think, I have to have a different life. I can't go on working in cafes for the rest of my life. And so I went and did some O-levels at the community college, which I found very, very tough. I was not a disciplined person.
And in the UK, is it easy? Is it a good system if you're 22 or 3 and you want to go back to school or you want to go back into education? Do they make that easy for you?
I think it's much harder now. I was one of those lucky people who was still there when there were grants and government grants for attending university. So, I guess that would put me off now, the thought of the debt, but maybe it wouldn't, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's certainly probably not as easy as it was, maybe.
Yeah, definitely not. So that's really tough, because I think a lot of people do, as I did, kind of come to a bit in their 20s and start to think, hey, shouldn't life be a bit different to this?
So Jane, how did we get from that, you being a hard-working undergraduate at university, to you becoming the founder and director of The Reader? I know it starts with a magazine, so maybe take us from there.
Well, I started the magazine because I was working in the university as a tutor. I'd probably about the age about 40, I guess, so quite a long time had gone by. And I'd been teaching in the university for a long time, part-time, and it seemed like everything I read that was serious about books was as if it was there to show off the critics, rather than try to encourage you to try things that might be too difficult for you. And so I founded the Reader magazine because I wanted a magazine with a voice for the reader in it. And then we started the magazine, had a bit of money to start it from a grant, and then it cost money to have a literary magazine. So we started putting on Readers' Days, where we would, round about 99, 2000, have a day, charge everyone £25 and make a profit out of the day, and then use it to subsidize the magazine. And meeting people on those Readers' Days, 100 people coming to read and talk about books together, I just began to realize there are people here who would never go to courses at the university, but they would go to something else, some other thing, I suppose, in business terms, a gap in the market. And then I was thinking about people like my mum, who by then was dead, and just thinking, if my mum had £25, she would go to the pub. She would not spend it on going to a Reader's Day, though she loved reading. And I began to think about people like her and think, well, they exist. People who might love this, who would never come and never pay, exist. And I want to find them and get them into reading. So that's really where The Reader started, from a kind of sorrow, I think, about my mum being dead, and the loss of what might have been different kinds of joy other than the joy of the pub.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who read, a lot of your motivation is from the earliest age, isn't it? The motivation is to share the joy. You think, how are there people who don't read, who don't understand that this is available to us?
Yeah.
So you went from there to the groups.
Yeah. So I started one group in the north end of Birkenhead. What happened with that was, I was thinking, I had this vaguely in mind that to do something like that, and then I was driving into the university to teach Wordsworth, and I pulled up at the traffic lights in Birkenhead by some council houses and saw there were daffodils at the edge of the garden, and saw a gran going up the path and knocking on the door and opening the door, and a woman and baby answered the door, and the babe, as Wordsworth says, leaped up in his mother's arms. And the line came into my mind, and then I thought, that baby growing up in the north end of Birkenhead, he will never have the experience I've just had of a line of poetry coming into your mind as the moment happens, and he won't get a good education, and he will never learn to love literature. That really, I don't know, is a profound punch in the gut, really, to say, do something. So I started the first group really right there at that traffic lights. There was a community centre. So I went back and had that first group. And then I guess after a few months of that, realised, this is something.
And Jane, how were you advertising that group? Were you saying, come to a group and we'll talk about books? or I will read to you? What was the carrot?
I had a picture of a woman deeply reading a book in what looked like a public library, and the headline said, "Get into reading." And then when I got there in the room, there were some people who'd come because they couldn't read. And community workers, someone in a GP surgery, an outreach person from a college had got a few people together. And when I realized 2 of them really were not literate, 6 people, 2 not literate, 1 had never read anything, was literate, but never read anything. I just thought, oh, well, I'll just read it out loud, as the barmaid came to life in me, and immediately thought, I've got this little bunch of people, I've got to make them happy. I'll read it out loud. And so
what kind of things did you read to them in those early days? What were the kind of first things you put your hand on?
The first thing in that first session was a short story by Russell Hoban, who you might know as a children's writer. Do you remember?
I do.
The Mouse and His Child is a great novel of his for chapter book children, and others. Lovely. What were they called? That little bear girl. Can't remember anyway. He had a whole series. So he was largely a children's writer, but he'd also written some adult stories and a few novels. And there was a story about a writer who was stuck, who was blocked, who went out and went for a walk and went to the British Museum and kind of got the spirit of a Chinese black lion and engaged with it. So it was just, it's a good story about being stuck, not just if you're a writer, but if you're any kind of person.
Yeah.
And how guilt can kind of tie you down if you're not careful. And I just thought, I'll take that because it's a good story and most adults will recognize it in some way. And I also took a poem that was from Tennyson. It was Crossing the Bar. And I just thought, I'll start with one and see how it goes, and etc. So we read the story, I think, over 2 or 3 sessions because it was long.
And I'd say you were a great reader, a read aloud person. Your face and your voice and everything.
Yeah.
Is that a big part of it, Jane? Is that really important?
I think it is important, except what's interesting is over time, it's also very moving when people aren't good readers. So if people want to take a turn at reading, for example, in that group, there was a woman who didn't read or hardly speak very much for nearly a year. And she said to me, a long way in, I read to my little boy now, just like you read to us here. And I thought that was fantastic that she was a foster parent, actually, and that she had not been able to do that through shyness or fear of doing it wrong or whatever it was, but now she was. And then after she'd said that in the group, she then, a little while later, volunteered to read. And so she wasn't a wonderful reader, but the very fact that everyone in the group knew, wow, this is a big deal for her, meant that it's like people were hanging on her every word. And I think that often happens. So you get a kind of, it's like a force field of, I'll call it love, between people in the group who, so if the reader isn't very good, it doesn't finally seem to matter because everybody's kind of going, go on.
There's something so emotional, isn't there, about the human voice telling a story, whatever way they do it, that draws you in.
Yes, that's right. And the sense of witnessing someone's triumph over silence or insecurity or whatever it is also very moving.
And that thing you said about, that woman who said, I read to my little boy now, I think that's another huge problem for parents who don't read. Then there'll be more children who don't read very often, because it happens often in the home is the first kind of step towards making a reader.
And I know a colleague said to me once that she was working in a special project with parents of preschool children. And she said one of the young women had said to her, oh, I just wouldn't read to him because he might think my voice was funny.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh, you poor devil, you.
So sad. And Jane, how did you go from that? Now you have one group. How does that become a charity with loads of groups and lots of things happening?
Well, it wasn't planned, I can tell you that. It just happened. Well, it happened because I suppose I had some great people as colleagues early on. I got a grant from Paul Hamlin Foundation for the Libraries Connect Fund, actually, long ago, and was able to employ some colleagues to help me. And they were fantastic. And I think the thing itself was the right thing at the right time. It seemed like people have loved it and do love it. So that made it grow. And
you went into extraordinary places.
Yeah, and we still do. I mean, one of the great things we've done during lockdown is we had a partnership with Crisis, the homelessness charity, and they were looking after people during the first lockdown who were London homeless people living on the streets, who were put into all the travel lodges and etc. during that first lockdown under very, very constrained conditions. And we made a relationship with them because those hotels have all got phones in.
Oh.
So we did reading down the phone as an offer, which we couldn't have done if people were still on the street, because most people don't have phones. And you just think that was a beautiful piece of work to say, you're stuck in this room 24 hours a day, with meals being delivered on a tray. It's a grim few months for people who, you might think it's better than being on the streets, but on the streets people had what they were used to, B, the habits of your life on the street and everything, and then suddenly, I won't say, and nearly saying it's like going into prison because of the isolation of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the reading was a wonderful piece of work there, and made us think, when this all changes, is there more we can do that's like this? So now we offer
that was genius,
community service of reading one-to-one. You're lonely, you're stuck at home, you can, etc.
But Jane, that was a genius idea, using the phone. Because a lot of people like that won't have a computer, they won't have any way. Did you do stuff as well online, like we're doing now? Did you do?
We've got loads online, and if anybody who's watching wants to go and have a poke around on our website at thereader.org and see, we've got a whole timetable of activities every day on Zoom or on Facebook Live, or audio that you can just take what you want from. And there's absolutely tons of it. And I've done some of the Facebook Lives, and that's really nice. It's just like, I read out loud when I'm doing it and talk about it as if I was in the room with you, but because I'm the only talker, people put their comments in, comments float up, and so on, try to respond to them. It's really lovely, really. And I've had people from foreign countries and, Yeah,
it has a great reach. I mean, even though we give out about everything being virtual now, but it does have a great reach. And Jane, what's the most, what kind of things do you remember about how reading aloud really affected somebody or helped to change their life? When you look back on all those things you've done, are there individuals you remember?
the biggest common factor everybody shares is something to do with what people call in evaluation or research confidence. But I'm not sure what that really is, because it seems very, very complicated. But I've got a case story here which I thought I might share with you.
Thank you. That'd be great.
If I haven't closed it down, which I probably have. Yeah, I can't see it now. But it was a lady who hadn't been to shared reading before lockdown, and has joined via Zoom. She has very, very bad ill health and extremely isolated. And, you know, she says even over Zoom, that listening and joining in, she says in this little case story about 6 times in 2 pages, my confidence has gone up so much, my confidence. And I've seen that literally hundreds and hundreds of times with people who've felt out of it or not part of. I suppose we get easily out of the habit of being with people. You know, like if you didn't have your job, if you didn't have a family nearby, and I guess that's the biggest thing. So there's a wonderful woman, I'm sorry I can't remember her name. She is one of our volunteers, and we met her at the chronic pain clinic at the Royal Liverpool Hospital, where we've been commissioned to provide shared readings for a long time now, 5 years or more. And so if you go there and see a consultant, they will offer you various things, but they'll also say, do you know, we have a shared reading group here, and it's really an excellent way of helping to manage pain. And so she was in that group, and she's, you know, she says reading already was part of her life. She'd been going to become a primary school teacher. She just finished her training when this, I think it's a neurological problem, affected her, and she hasn't been able to work, and she uses a wheelchair and is in pain all the time. So books have always helped me, but coming to the group, it is more than that. And she is now running that group. She didn't just come to it, she runs it. She's built a sort of, I guess, a sense of being and meaning and purpose out of that. There's a lovely film of her, actually, which I'll send a link to, and you'll be able to see her talking about it. So those many such stories, but I guess there's me. Here I am. You know, if you'd seen me when I was 14, you wouldn't have thought I'd be talking to you in Galway.
It's brilliant though, isn't it, that books did that for you, and now you're doing so much for other people and for books as well, keeping the whole thing alive. And and I know you have the last thing we chance to talk about is you have a building now, I think, the charity has.
Yeah, so this has been a very sad part of the COVID experience, because we opened the building in September last year and had 6 months of it working before we had to shut down in March. And the purpose of the building was...
Jane? What is its function? Is that like a centre for people to...
It's the International Centre for Shared Reading. So it's a model to show people this is what can happen if you have shared reading all day, every day. Brilliant. It's a place where we can train people. So internationally, we've got partnerships in more than a dozen countries now where sister organizations are building shared reading movements like us. So we have a lot of international visitors. And it's also a local, if you like, centre for community in South Liverpool. Just it's there. It's a building in a park, so lots of people come to the park, and it's big. It's sort of 40 rooms, and we've made a big part of it into public cafe. It's very beautiful. We've done it up. It's been a long haul doing it. Started the mansion project in about 2011. So, you know, it's a long shot. And the idea was somewhere where everybody can find something meaningful to take home, whether that's a knit and natter group, you know, of which we have 3, or whether it's summer eats in the back garden, or Santa's postman trail in the park, which we're doing now as a partnership with Walker Books for families. So you can have a day out and there'll be loads of stuff to do with the book, but you're outside in the park.
It sounds like a terrific resource and something your charity so deserves, and you personally so deserve. Well done, and it's been absolutely lovely talking to you, Jane, and inspiring as ever. So I hope we'll see you in person soon in Ireland.
Yeah, thanks very much.
You're
really,
welcome.
really lovely to see you again and to have a chance for a chat.
And you.
Hope the conference goes really well.
Thank you. So I hope you were as inspired as I was with that chat with Jane Davis. And what a lovely way to leave it at that.